53 years after pilot Daniel Whitaker vanished without a trace, his plane was finally found, deep in the mountains where no one thought to look. It had been a mystery frozen in time, a ghost story whispered by locals until the forest decided to give him back. The hikers hadn't meant to find it. They were just three friends out for a late summer trek through the Cascades, chasing a shortcut back to their campsite after the sun had started to dip. The trail they followed wasn't marked on any map, only hinted at by a thinning of trees and the faint crunch of old boot tracks beneath the moss. Everything smelled of pine and rain. The air was heavy, still, the kind of quiet that makes you whisper without knowing why. One of them, a teacher from Portland named Ryan Keller, was the first to notice it. A sliver of dull gray metal glinting through the underbrush, half buried in roots and ferns. At first, he thought it was just a piece of logging equipment, maybe some abandoned machinery from the 70s. But as he brushed away the moss, the shape began to take form. Rivets, faded, white paint. A curve that looked unmistakably like the edge of an aircraft fuselage. "Guys, you need to see this," he said quietly. They laughed at first, until they didn't. Because just a few feet away, they found the propeller bent, rusted, and wedged between two trees that had grown tall around it, as if the forest itself had been guarding it all these years. The insignia on the metal was nearly erased by time, but the faint outline of letters still showed through. N14, 6 Bravo. Ryan didn't know what those numbers meant, but someone did. When they reported the coordinates later that evening, local authorities ran the registration and went silent for a long moment. Then one of them said, almost in disbelief, "That's Danny Whitaker's plane, the one that went missing back in '71. The news spread quickly through the small Washington town of Ellensburg, the same town Danny had flown out of half a century earlier. People who had long since stopped talking about him found the name back on their lips, like a ghost had been reintroduced into their lives. Some were stunned, some uneasy, others almost afraid. Because everyone remembered how strange that disappearance had been, how fast the story had been buried, how abruptly the search had ended. But to understand that discovery in the woods, we need to go back to where it all began. It was the fall of 1971, a crisp October morning, when Danny Whitaker wheeled his single-engine Cessna out from the hangar. He'd been flying since he was 16, and the sky felt more like home than any house ever had. His friends said he could navigate through storms by instinct alone, that he had a sixth sense for air currents and mountain winds. He was a bush pilot, one of those rare souls who thrived in the unpredictable. That morning, the air smelled faintly of fuel and frost. A light fog clung to the runway at Bowers Field. Danny had a thermos of coffee tucked beside him in the cockpit, a habit from years of early flights. He was heading east to Boise, Idaho, a route he'd taken hundreds of times, usually to ferry small cargo or documents for private clients. It was supposed to be a quick trip, no more than a few hours. He waved to the mechanic, gave the all clear, and taxied down the strip. Witnesses recalled how the Cessna lifted gracefully into the gray sky, its engine fading into a hum that blended with the wind. It was just another flight until it wasn't. The first sign of trouble came about 40 minutes later. A brief radio transmission from Danny crackled through static, visibility dropping, adjusting course southward. His tone was calm, controlled. There was a bit of wind interference, but nothing unusual for the mountains. Then came another pilot's reply, a friendly voice from a nearby flight confirming Danny's position on radar. That was the last anyone ever heard from him. When the Cessna failed to land in Boise that afternoon, the tower contacted Ellensburg. No distress call, no emergency beacon, no wreckage, just silence. By nightfall, a storm had rolled over the Cascades, covering everything in snow and fog. Search teams were grounded. The next morning, helicopters went up. Nothing. The mountains swallowed him whole. Over the following weeks, hundreds joined the search. Civil Air Patrol, forest rangers, volunteers from nearby towns. They combed valleys, scanned ridgelines, followed reports of glints of metal that turned out to be nothing more than ice or debris. Danny's wife, Margaret, stood by the radio every night, her hands wrapped around that same thermos he'd taken flying, as if holding onto it might somehow call him home. Rumors started almost immediately. Some said he'd flown too far south and crashed in Oregon. Others whispered he'd been carrying something valuable: cash, gold, even stolen goods. There were those who believed he'd simply run, staged his disappearance, and started over somewhere else. But anyone who knew him really knew him, refused to believe that. Danny Whitaker wasn't the kind of man who ran from anything. And yet, as the days turned into weeks and the snow began to fall thicker, hope thinned. By December, the official search was suspended. No sign of the aircraft, the report read. Presumed lost. Margaret never accepted that. Every spring, when the snow melted and the rivers ran fast with runoff, she'd drive up to the trailheads with a pair of binoculars and maps spread across the hood of her car. She told people she just wanted to look, to feel close to him. Some said they saw her standing at dusk on the edge of the ridge, staring into the distance, as if expecting to see a small white plane cutting through the clouds again. For 53 years, the mountain kept its secret. Trees grew where fire once burned. Animals nested in the hollow of what was left behind. Seasons cycled, and memories faded. Until those hikers came along. When the recovery teams arrived 2 days later, they had to hike nearly 9 miles through steep, uneven terrain to reach the site. The crash was unlike anything they'd seen before. The fuselage was crushed, but surprisingly intact, preserved by the cold and shielded by dense canopy overhead. Inside, they found a tangle of metal, dirt, and vines, and near the pilot's seat, something unmistakably human. A skeleton, still belted in, the remnants of a leather jacket clinging to the frame. The coroner's early notes suggested the impact hadn't been immediate. A broken arm, fractured ribs, but signs that he might have survived, at least for a while. Near the seat was a flare gun, rusted but unused. And beside it, something even stranger, a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages nearly fused by moisture. When investigators opened it days later in a controlled lab, the first line read, October 25th. Storm hit sooner than expected. I'm alive. Plane's gone. Trying to stay warm. And beneath that, a final entry. Smudged, half erased, but barely legible. Someone's coming. I can hear them. No one could explain that. The handwriting matched samples from Danny's flight logs, verified by experts. But the question that haunted everyone wasn't who he was hearing, it was when. Because, according to the wreckage analysis, the plane hadn't gone down exactly where it was supposed to. It had been shifted more than a mile from the estimated impact site. The scrape marks along the fuselage suggested it had been dragged, not by natural forces, but by human hands. Whatever happened to Danny Whitaker in those mountains, it didn't end when his plane hit the ground. And as the town of Ellensburg would soon discover, finding the plane was only the beginning. Before he became the man whose name would echo through half a century of unanswered questions, Daniel Whitaker was simply Danny from down by the airfield. He grew up in Ellensburg, a small Washington town cradled by wheat fields and framed by the distant peaks of the Cascades. If you stood on the hill behind his family's house, you could see the runway lights from Bowers Field blinking faintly in the distance, tiny, winking stars that seemed to call him even when he was a boy. His mother used to say that Danny could recognize the sound of a plane before he could even spell the word. He'd pause mid-sentence, tilt his head toward the sky, and name the type of aircraft just by the engine note. Cessna, he'd say softly, or Beechcraft, or that's a Piper Cub, for sure. It wasn't just fascination, it was instinct. He built toy models out of scrap tin and balsa wood, begged his father for flying lessons before he was a teenager, and spent his Saturdays washing planes just to be near them. By 16, he was taking real lessons old school, seat-of-the-pants instruction from a veteran pilot named Hank Dorset, who'd flown mail routes through the Rockies back in the 40s. Hank was gruff, cigarette always hanging from his lips, but he saw something in Danny. That kid's born with wings, he told people at the bar. All I'm doing is teaching him how to use them. Danny soloed on his 17th birthday. The memory stuck with everyone who saw it, the small white plane lifting gracefully from the strip, banking low over the fields as if it were bowing to the town before disappearing into a golden haze. His parents cried. His instructor just nodded, proud but unsurprised. After high school, Danny didn't leave Ellensburg. He had offers bigger airports, charter companies, even a shot at commercial training, but he loved the kind of flying most pilots hated, the unpredictable, low-altitude, dirt runway kind of flying. He started taking contracts that sent him deep into the wilderness, hauling mail to mountain towns, delivering supplies to ranger stations, ferrying surveyors, hunters, and geologists to remote airstrips that were barely cleared of brush. It was dangerous work. The pay wasn't great, but the freedom was. When I'm up there, he told his sister, It's just me in the sky. No noise, no rules. You can see forever. In town, people called him reliable, steady hands, good heart. He'd help fix an old tractor for a farmer, buy coffee for the line guys at the airport, and always double-check his weather reports before a flight. But underneath that calm reliability, there was something else, a restlessness, a hunger for something beyond routine. Those who knew him best said he wasn't content unless there was risk involved. He liked a challenge, one friend said later, maybe a little too much. By the late 1960s, Danny had earned a reputation as one of the best bush pilots in the Pacific Northwest. He'd flown through storms that grounded others. He'd landed on strips barely wider than a driveway, and he never lost a client or a cargo, not once. Then came the contract that changed everything. In early October of 1971, Danny was approached by a man named Robert Gaines, a timber investor with business across state lines. Gaines wanted a discreet cargo run, a few sealed crates from Ellensburg to Boise. He said they contained geological samples, rock cores for some mining survey. It wasn't unusual work, not on paper, and Danny had done similar jobs before, but something about Gaines unsettled him. The man wore expensive boots, drove a brand new Cadillac, and spoke with the kind of practiced charm that felt just a bit too smooth. Still, money was tight that month. The lumber routes were slowing down for winter, and Danny needed the extra cash. He agreed to the job. He never told Margaret what was inside the crates, only that it was nothing dangerous. She didn't ask questions. She trusted him. Margaret and Danny had met 6 years earlier, in a diner just off the highway. She was a waitress, saving up for nursing school, and he was a pilot with grease on his hands and wind in his hair. They married within a year, bought a small house near the airport, and spent most evenings sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains. They wanted kids, but life and Danny's unpredictable flight schedule always seemed to get in the way. Still, they were happy. She used to joke that she was married to the sky as much as to him. The morning of his disappearance, she woke to the sound of his alarm at 5:30. He moved quietly, careful not to wake her, but she stirred anyway. She remembered the way the light fell through the curtains, the smell of coffee, and the sound of his boots on the kitchen tile. "Be safe," she said sleepily from the doorway. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "Always." She didn't know those would be the last words she'd ever hear him speak. Later that morning, when Margaret went to work at the clinic, she passed by the airport and saw his Cessna on the tarmac. She thought about waving but didn't want to distract him during pre-flight checks. She told herself she'd see him that evening. By noon, the storm had rolled in faster than anyone expected. Clouds thickened, and wind gusts hit the ridgelines. Margaret remembered glancing at the sky and thinking it looked angry. She didn't know that, at that very moment, Danny was radioing the tower, trying to reroute around the weather front. His calm voice on the radio, the last recording of him, would later be played over and over again by investigators, searching for clues in the static. The disappearance hit Ellensburg like a thunderclap. The next morning, the front page of the Daily Record carried the headline, "Local Pilot Missing Over Cascades." Beneath it, a grainy photo of Danny smiling beside his Cessna, sleeves rolled up, looking effortlessly confident. The image didn't match the panic that was unfolding behind closed doors. Margaret barely slept. Neighbors dropped off casseroles and kept vigil at her house. Reporters gathered near the airfield. For days, helicopters crisscrossed the mountains, their rotors echoing through valleys. The Civil Air Patrol used maps and early radar data to guess where he might have gone down. Pilots reported seeing bits of metal glinting from slopes, all false leads. 1 week in, a hiker found a small piece of aluminum near Cle Elum Lake, and everyone's hopes surged until experts identified it as debris from a military training crash years earlier. The search pushed further west, deeper into territory few had ever mapped. As the weeks passed, the tone shifted. Officials began using phrases like, "presumed deceased," but Margaret refused to hold a funeral. "Not until I see him," she said simply. "Not until I know." She wasn't the only one who couldn't let go. Hank Dorset, the old pilot who'd trained Danny, organized his own independent search with a few other flyers. They pooled their fuel money, packed supplies, and flew grid patterns across the Cascades for nearly a month. They never found so much as a scrap of the plane. "It's like the damn thing got swallowed," Hank muttered to a reporter. "Like the mountain decided it wanted him." By Christmas, the official search was over. The snow had buried everything. The authorities filed the paperwork, and the case went cold. But strange details lingered, details that would resurface decades later. For one, Robert Gaines, the man who'd hired Danny, vanished not long after. His company dissolved within weeks. When investigators tried to track him down, they found nothing but an empty office and unpaid bills. The crates Danny had been transporting were never located. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself haunted by small reminders. The coffee mug still sitting by the sink, his jacket on the hook, his logbook open on the kitchen table. She started writing letters to him, dozens of them, and kept them in a box under the bed. Some were filled with anger, others with hope. All ended the same way: come home. Every year on October 23rd, the anniversary of the flight, she drove up to the lookout point off Manistash Ridge. She'd leave a thermos of coffee and sit there until sunset. Locals who passed her sometimes said she looked like she was listening for something, maybe an engine in the distance, maybe a voice. By the time the 80s rolled around, most people had stopped talking about Danny Whitaker. The story had become a cautionary tale for young pilots, a reminder of how unforgiving the Cascades could be. But among older residents, it never quite faded. They'd lower their voices when mentioning him, as if the mountains might be listening. And once in a while, someone swore they saw something. A hunter claimed he'd found a patch of scorched trees deep in the wilderness that looked like the aftermath of a crash. A logger reported hearing what he thought was the echo of an engine in a valley where no plane should have been flying. None of it ever led anywhere, but it kept the legend alive. Margaret died in 1998, still without answers. Her last wish, according to her niece, was simple: if they ever find him, tell him I never stopped waiting. And then, after 53 long years of silence, the mountain finally spoke. When investigators examined Danny's old flight logs after the wreck was found, they noticed something odd in the entries leading up to that final flight. He'd written brief cryptic notes about his cargo, not the usual details pilots record, but short phrases like, "Don't trust the buyer," and "check the weight again." One entry, dated just 2 days before he vanished, simply read, "Feels wrong, one last run." No one could say for sure what he meant. But one thing was clear: whatever Danny Whitaker was flying that day in 1971, it wasn't just geological samples. And as forensic teams began to comb through the wreckage in 2024, they would soon find that the truth buried in those mountains was darker and far more complicated than anyone ever imagined. The morning of October 23rd, 1971, began like any other for Daniel Whitaker, cold, calm, and brimming with the quiet kind of confidence only a pilot who's mastered the sky can carry. The sun hadn't yet cleared the Cascades when he arrived at the hangar. The ground shimmered faintly with frost, the kind that crunches beneath boots and smells faintly of oil and pine. A light fog drifted across the airfield, hugging the edges of the runway like a secret waiting to be told. Danny ran his gloved hand across the Cessna's nose, brushing away a thin layer of dew. The plane was more than machinery to him. It was a companion. He called it Lark, after the bird that always flew low across the wheat fields near his house. It wasn't new, a Cessna 182 with scuffed paint and a few dings from years of hard landings, but Danny treated it like treasure. Every bolt, every rivet, every gauge was his responsibility. Inside the hangar, the mechanic, old Ray Pritchard, was pouring himself coffee from a metal thermos. He squinted toward Danny, gave a half salute, and said, "You're up early again. You sure you want to fly today? That front's moving in faster than they said." Danny smiled. "You know me, Ray. A little weather keeps it interesting." Ray frowned. "Storm like that doesn't play fair. I'd wait it out if I were you." But waiting wasn't something Danny knew how to do. He'd flown through worse wind that knocked planes sideways, snow that made the horizon disappear. He believed in preparation, not hesitation. He checked the fuel, tested the flaps, tapped the altimeter, and listened to the faint hum of the engine coming to life. Everything sounded perfect. At 6:30, the man with the cargo arrived. Robert Gaines stepped out of a silver Cadillac, the kind that looked out of place in a dusty airfield. His shoes were polished, his coat too fine for the weather. He carried a cigarette between 2 fingers and a briefcase in the other hand. Behind him, a truck pulled up, with 2 wooden crates in the bed. They were unmarked, no labels, no stamps, nothing to say where they'd come from or what they contained. Danny watched as the men from the truck began loading them into the plane's cargo hold. They were heavy. He could feel the tail dip slightly as they slid the last one inside. What's in them again? Danny asked casually. Gaines smiled, showing too many teeth. Samples, rocks, soil, the usual. I told your guy on the phone. Danny nodded, but something in his gut didn't settle. He'd been flying long enough to know when something felt off. The weight distribution was uneven, too much mass on one side. He adjusted it carefully, rebalancing the load. If these aren't secured right, they'll shift mid-air, he warned. Gaines' smile faltered for just a moment. Then make sure they don't. He handed Danny a sealed envelope, half payment up front, half on delivery. You'll drop it off at a private airstrip outside Boise. Coordinates are inside. Someone will meet you there. Danny took the envelope and tucked it into his jacket pocket. You'll get your cargo safe and sound, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Gaines lingered a moment longer than necessary, watching as Danny climbed into the cockpit. The way his eyes followed the plane, you'd think he was sending it to war. At 6:45, the Cessna taxied onto the runway. The radio crackled to life. Bowers Tower, this is Cessna N146 Bravo, requesting takeoff clearance to Boise via Yakima Air Corridor. The reply came through, calm and clear. Cessna N146 Bravo, you are cleared for departure. Have a safe flight, Danny. The engine roared, tires hummed against the tarmac, and the plane lifted smoothly into the morning sky. Below him, the patchwork of farmland and forest stretched out like a quilt. The early light painted everything in muted gold, the kind of day that felt too perfect to end badly. At 7:30, he passed over Yakima, steady at 5,000 feet. The first thin clouds began to appear, nothing dangerous yet, but they thickened quickly. The radio chatter was light, mostly small talk between pilots, sharing updates about turbulence and visibility. Looks like it's closing in faster than they said, one pilot remarked. Danny replied, I see it. Might have to swing south if it keeps building. A pause, then laughter. You and your shortcuts, Whitaker. He grinned. Just efficient. That was the last time anyone heard his laugh. By 8 o'clock, weather radar showed a sudden shift, a storm cell forming near the southern ridges. Wind speeds increased, pushing cold air from the coast inland. For most pilots, that would have been the signal to turn back. But Danny wasn't most pilots. He adjusted his heading slightly, hoping to skirt the edge of the system. For a while, it worked. But as he approached the Cascade range, visibility dropped sharply. The clouds thickened into a gray wall, swallowing the peaks. Snow began to fall, light at first, then harder. Inside the cockpit, the world turned white. He flicked on the de-icer, scanned his instruments, and adjusted trim to counter the wind. His breathing slowed. He was calm, methodical. He'd been here before. But something wasn't right with the controls. The plane felt heavier than it should. He glanced back at the cargo. One of the crates had shifted slightly, its straps strained. He made a note to resecure it when he landed. At 8:27, he made his final radio transmission. Visibility dropping, adjusting course southward. Static swallowed the rest. Minutes later, radar contact vanished. No distress call, no emergency beacon, just silence. The storm grew violent over the next hour, battering the region with snow and wind. Ground crews lost visual contact completely. By noon, they declared an overdue status. Back at Bowers Field, Ray Pritchard lit one cigarette after another, pacing the hangar. He'll show up, he muttered. He always does. But even he didn't sound convinced. By nightfall, search and rescue was mobilized. Planes flew grid patterns through the valleys the next morning, but the snow had already covered any possible sign of wreckage. The first few days were chaos. Reports came from everywhere. A camper near Lake Caches claimed to have heard an explosion. A farmer in Cle Elum said he saw smoke on the ridgeline. Rangers investigated every lead, only to find nothing, no debris, no oil slick, no burn marks. It was as if the plane had dissolved into the storm. Margaret waited by the phone, wrapped in one of Danny's old flannel shirts. Each ring sent her heart racing. Every time it wasn't him, the silence afterward cut deeper. She left the porch light on, every night, like a beacon. Neighbors tried to console her, but she barely heard them. He knows those skies, she kept saying. He'll come home. Days passed, then weeks. The official search lasted 34 days before being suspended. The final report cited severe weather conditions and inaccessible terrain. Behind closed doors, however, investigators were uneasy. The cargo manifest filed by Gaines listed a total weight that didn't match what was recorded in Danny's flight log. His Cessna had been carrying nearly 80 pounds more than declared. When questioned, Gaines insisted it was a clerical error. Then, within days, he was gone, office cleared out, bank accounts emptied, car abandoned in a long-term parking lot in Seattle. No forwarding address, no explanation. Without him, the case fell apart. The press lost interest by Christmas. The headlines faded. Margaret refused interviews. She focused instead on keeping his memory alive, keeping his name from being buried alongside the mountain that took him. For years, the area where Danny vanished was considered cursed by local pilots. Some swore they could feel static on the radio when flying over that stretch, even in clear weather. One pilot claimed he heard a faint voice once, a man saying, "Hold course south," before the signal vanished. Most dismissed it as interference. But among the older flyers, it became something more, a quiet superstition, a reminder that the sky never forgets. When the hikers stumbled upon the wreck in 2024, the coordinates placed it nearly 9 miles off Danny's planned flight path. That fact alone baffled investigators. The terrain was brutal, dense forest, steep ridges, and no clearings suitable for even an emergency landing. How had he ended up there? Some experts suggested he'd been trying to climb above the weather and got caught in a downdraft. Others speculated mechanical failure. But a few, studying the wreck itself, noticed details that didn't fit any of those explanations. The flaps were set to a landing position, not cruise. The seatbelt buckle on the passenger side was latched, though Danny had been flying alone. And the damage patterns on the fuselage indicated the plane had been dragged across the ground long after impact. It meant someone had been there. Maybe to salvage parts, maybe to hide something, or maybe to make sure the crash stayed hidden. And if that's true, then the real question isn't how Danny crashed. It's who found him first, and what they were trying to keep buried for 53 years. When the first snowstorm broke over the Cascades that October night, Ellensburg went quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a small town when everyone's holding their breath at once. Word had already spread the radio tower couldn't reach Danny Whitaker's plane. It had gone off radar. In the diner on Main Street, people stared at the news crackling over the little transistor radio on the counter. Pilot overdue, severe weather hampering search. The waitress, who had known Danny since he was a teenager washing dishes in that very place, stood frozen with a coffee pot mid-air. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, bending the streetlights. Margaret was home, pacing between the living room and the kitchen phone. Every time she sat down, the silence grew too heavy, so she stood again. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. She'd tried calling the airfield half a dozen times already, and each time the same voice, tired, apologetic, said, "Nothing yet, Mrs. Whitaker. We'll call you as soon as we hear." By midnight, there were no more flights. The storm had shut everything down. At dawn, when the first search planes lifted off, the mountains looked like something out of another world. Ridges blanketed in fog, treetops glistening with new snow, clouds hanging low and heavy. The men flying those missions said it felt like searching for a ghost in a world that didn't want to be found. Civil Air Patrol, this is Bravo 7. Negative visual on anything resembling wreckage. Visibility down to half a mile. All day, that was the refrain. Nothing. Over and over. Meanwhile, back at Bowers Field, volunteers poured in, local pilots, farmers with four-wheel drives, forest rangers, even college kids home for the weekend. They set up a command post inside the hangar, maps spread across tables, red circles marking possible flight paths. Someone brought soup, someone else brought blankets. The smell of coffee hung thick in the air, masking the faint tang of aviation fuel. Margaret sat in a folding chair by the wall, wrapped in Danny's old bomber jacket. The fur collar brushed against her cheek every time she turned her head. People whispered around her, trying not to let her hear the words no one wanted to say. At noon, a call came in. A park ranger had spotted something metallic near Lake Caches, a possible reflection from the slope above the tree line. Helicopters were dispatched immediately. For 2 hours, everyone held their breath. Then came the callback. False alarm, just ice glinting in the Sunday. By nightfall, the first day had yielded nothing. The storm returned, harder this time. Wind howled against the hangar doors. The planes grounded again. Day 2 brought clearer skies, but the snow on the ridges made flying treacherous. Searchers shifted to the valleys, combing logging roads and frozen creeks. Teams on foot trudged through waist-deep drifts, calling his name even though they knew he couldn't answer. "Danny, can you hear us?" Only the wind replied. The days blurred together. Every morning, the same ritual: pilots reviewing grids, teams setting out, radio chatter, the long hours of waiting. Each night, the same result: no plane. No signal, no hope. On the fifth day, a helicopter crew thought they saw smoke rising from a clearing near Stampede Pass. For a heartbeat, everyone dared to believe. But when they reached it, they found only the remnants of a forest fire from weeks earlier: charred branches, cold ash. "Nature plays cruel tricks," one of the pilots said afterward. Margaret began to sleep in her car outside the hangar, refusing to go home. "He's out there," she told anyone who tried to convince her otherwise. "He hates the cold. He'll be trying to keep warm. We just have to find him." The search expanded 20 aircraft, more than 100 ground personnel, dogs, snowmobiles. Reporters began to arrive, cameras flashing, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. "Do you think he crashed? Could he have run away? Was he carrying anything unusual?" Margaret turned away from them, clutching her thermos. "My husband's not a story," she whispered. But soon, he became one anyway. Within a week, the newspapers in Seattle and Boise were printing headlines like, "Pilot vanishes in Cascades storm search enters second week." They called it a mystery of the modern age. A plane disappearing in plain sight. Old-timers at the bar speculated endlessly. Some said the wind currents could have carried him north, into Canada. Others thought he might have gone down in one of the uncharted valleys west of Clay Elum, where cliffs were so steep that even helicopters couldn't descend safely. Then came the rumors. A hunter claimed he'd heard a faint SOS signal on his shortwave radio 2 nights after the crash. A trucker swore he saw flashing lights near Snoqualmie Pass that same evening. Neither account could be verified, but they fueled hope where logic had failed. Margaret clung to that hope like it was oxygen. She spent hours listening to the radio, scanning static for any hint of her husband's voice. She'd sit in the dark, whispering to herself, "Come on, Danny. Come on, sweetheart. Just call." The days turned to weeks. Then, on the 13th day, the first real clue appeared. A snowplow driver clearing a forest road found a scrap of metal wedged in the ice, curved, riveted, with a faint trace of paint. The number stenciled on it read, 146B. Danny's plane was registered as N146 Bravo. The piece was small, barely larger than a hand, but it reignited the search. The Air Force joined in, providing reconnaissance flights and radar scans. For 3 more days, they scoured the area where the part had been found, but found nothing else. Later, experts determined the fragment wasn't from the Cessna. After all, it belonged to a military training aircraft that had crashed in the same range back in the 50s. Another dead end. By November, the snowpack grew too deep. The search was officially suspended until conditions improve. Everyone knew that meant it was over. Except Margaret. She refused to sign the death certificate. She refused to let the insurance company close the case. Every spring, when the snow began to melt, she'd return to the trailheads with maps and binoculars, tracing lines across the valleys. Some called it denial, others called it love. In her living room, she hung a map of Washington with red pins marking every place they'd searched. By the time she was done, it looked like a constellation of unanswered questions. The community tried to move on, but the story clung to them. The young mechanics at the airfield grew up hearing about Danny Whitaker, the pilot who disappeared. Kids dared each other to sneak up to the ridge at night and listen for the sound of his plane. Some swore they heard it, faint and distant, the low hum of an engine circling endlessly through the clouds. The mystery began to take on a life of its own. In 1972, a group of volunteer hikers found a rusted watchband in the woods near Lake Keechelis. It was old and worn, the kind pilots often wore. The newspapers printed it as possible clue in missing pilot case, but testing later revealed it wasn't Danny's. Year after year, the forest gave up small, meaningless offerings: a shoe sole, a metal latch, fragments of glass, each one raising and dashing hopes anew. But underneath it all, the whispers grew darker. Some locals claimed the crash wasn't an accident. They said Danny had been carrying something valuable: money, documents, or contraband, and that someone didn't want it found. Others insisted they'd seen strange vehicles in the woods the week after the crash, unmarked trucks driving at night, their headlights covered. Most dismissed it as small-town gossip. But for those who knew Danny, especially Hank Dorset, his old instructor. The story didn't sit right. "I've flown storms like that," Hank told a reporter years later. He could have turned back. He should have. But for him to just vanish? That's not weather. That's something else. When the wreck was finally discovered in 2024, all those old suspicions came roaring back. Investigators combing through the crash site noted something strange. The survival gear stored under the seat was missing. The emergency beacon, which should have activated on impact, was gone. And the condition of the fuselage scuff marks along the underside, scratches that ran horizontally rather than from impact suggested movement. Someone had been there. Someone had found that plane long before those hikers ever did. But back in 1971, none of that was known. Back then, there was only grief and a mountain that refused to speak. When winter finally swallowed Ellensburg that year, Margaret stood alone on the ridge overlooking the valley. Snow fell gently around her, settling on her hair, her shoulders, her boots. In her hands, she held Danny's flight logbook, the one he'd left at home. The last entry read simply, "Boise run clear morning, should be back by dusk." She traced the words with her thumb, as if doing so might somehow summon him back from wherever he'd gone. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of pine and diesel. She looked up, scanning the empty sky. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a heartbeat, she thought she heard it. That familiar hum, soft and distant. A plane engine, turning over the ridge, fading into the clouds. She closed her eyes. "Come home," she whispered. "Please." But the mountains stayed silent. And for 53 years, they would keep their secret. By the time the snow began to melt in the spring of 1972, Ellensburg had turned into a town of whispers. The posters with Danny Whitaker's smiling face still clung to telephone poles, their edges curling from months of wind and rain. The official search had ended, the helicopters were gone, but people couldn't stop talking about him. Every corner booth in the diner, every stool at the bar, there was always someone retelling the story of the pilot who disappeared and the plane that never came home. At first, it was sympathy that kept the conversation alive. "Poor Margaret," people said. "Such a shame, such a tragedy." But over time, sympathy gave way to something else, curiosity. Because too many things didn't add up. For one, there was the cargo. Everyone knew Danny had taken a private contract that day, but no one seemed to know what he was carrying. Official reports said geological samples, but the men at the airfield swore the crates looked too heavy, too well built, to be full of rocks. "More like money," one of them muttered. "Or something you don't want bouncing around in turbulence." And then there was the man who'd hired him, Robert Gaines. He'd shown up in town like a ghost, all polished shoes and slick talk, and disappeared the same way. When reporters started asking about him, they found nothing. No business address, no record of his company, not even a valid driver's license. It was as if he'd never existed. 2 months after the crash, a Seattle newspaper ran an exposé titled, "The Vanishing Pilot, What Was Danny Whitaker Really Flying?" It quoted anonymous sources who claimed the crates had been packed under heavy guard, late at night, and that the paperwork had been signed under a false name. Margaret refused to read it. She told friends she didn't care what he'd been carrying, she just wanted him back. But late at night, when she thought no one was looking, she'd sit on the porch and stare down the highway, wondering if maybe she hadn't known her husband as well as she thought. Then, in June, a stranger arrived in town. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, an insurance investigator from Spokane. Mid-40s, graying hair, sharp eyes that didn't seem to miss much. He said he was reviewing the claim for Danny's lost aircraft routine, he insisted. But his questions were anything but. "How long had Mr. Whitaker known this client, Robert Gaines?" he asked. "Did he often transport cargo for private individuals? Did he ever mention being worried about money?" Margaret answered politely at first, but she could tell he already knew more than he was letting on. When she asked to see his credentials, he flashed a badge quickly, too quickly, and changed the subject. That evening, he showed up at the airfield, asking to see Danny's hangar. He examined the workbench, the logbooks, even the maintenance tools. "Everything in its place," he muttered. "Neat, as a preacher's Bible." He lingered over one particular detail, a small metal locker bolted to the wall. When Ray Pritchard, the mechanic, told him it had been locked since Danny's disappearance, the man's expression changed. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked. Ray hesitated, then nodded. The lock was old, rusted. With a quick twist of his screwdriver, it popped open. Inside was a small canvas pouch, the kind pilots used to store navigation charts. But there were no charts inside, only a folded piece of paper and an envelope marked RG. The paper was a flight map with several hand-drawn notations, alternate routes, coordinates, and a circle around a section of the Cascades, well south of Danny's intended path. The envelope contained a single sheet of typewritten text. It read, "Deliver as agreed. Payment upon confirmation. No diversions." At the bottom, in smaller letters, "Failure to comply equals termination." Ray glanced up. "What the hell does that mean?" The so-called investigator didn't answer. He folded the papers carefully, slipped them into his briefcase, and said, "You didn't see this." Then he left. The next day, he was gone. When Margaret tried to contact the insurance company in Spokane, they told her no one named Frank Howard worked there and never had. That was when the gossip in Ellensburg shifted from confusion to fear. "Maybe Danny knew something he wasn't supposed to," one local said. "Maybe that's why his plane went down." Others whispered darker things, that he'd been smuggling money for organized crime, that he'd found out too late and tried to back out. Some even claimed they'd seen headlights in the woods the night of the crash, vehicles moving where no roads existed. A retired sheriff, Tom Briggs, started his own quiet investigation. He'd been part of the original search, and the whole thing still gnawed at him. "A plane doesn't just vanish," he told his wife. "And men like Gaines don't show up out of nowhere unless they've got something to hide." Briggs drove out to the site where Danny was last tracked on radar, a patch of rugged wilderness between Caches and Chinook Pass. He interviewed old loggers, hikers, anyone who might have seen something. Most had nothing useful to say, but one old trapper, a recluse named Jonah, told him a story that made the hair rise on his neck. "I saw lights in them woods 2 nights after that plane went missing," Jonah said. "Bright ones, like flashlights or lanterns. Heard men's voices too, low and angry. Then the lights went out. Next morning, there were fresh tire tracks in the snow, leading down to the creek bed. Too far from any road for normal folks." Briggs followed up, hiking into the same area weeks later. The tracks were long gone, but near the creek, he found something half buried in the mud, a piece of torn fabric with a bit of metal still attached. The metal had faint etchings. Cessna. He sent it to the county lab for analysis. The results came back inconclusive, could be from any Cessna model, but Briggs wasn't satisfied. He filed his own report, noting the coordinates and his suspicions that the crash site might have been tampered with. The report was quietly filed away and never acted upon. And then something strange happened. Briggs's house was broken into 2 nights later. Nothing was stolen except his notebook and a single envelope labeled Whitaker. The door hadn't been forced. Whoever came in had a key or knew how to pick a lock without leaving a trace. When he reported it, the sheriff's department dismissed it as coincidence. "Probably kids," they said. But Briggs wasn't convinced. He stopped digging after that. A week later, he retired early and moved to Montana. By the late 70s, the rumors had grown into legend. Every time a storm rolled over the mountains, someone would bring up Danny Whitaker, the pilot who vanished with a secret. The more time passed, the wilder the stories became. Some said he'd been running guns for the CIA. Others swore he'd stumbled onto something the government wanted hidden. Margaret tried to ignore it, but even she couldn't shake the unease. In 1978, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single line written in block letters. "He didn't crash by accident." She brought it to the police. They opened an investigation, traced the postmark to Portland, and hit a dead end. The case file grew thicker, but no closer to the truth. Then, one quiet afternoon, she got a visit from a man in uniform, a pilot from the Air National Guard. He introduced himself as Captain Lee. He said he'd been reviewing old flight records and noticed something odd about Danny's last transmission. "There's a discrepancy in the coordinates he gave," Captain Lee explained. "The path he described doesn't line up with his supposed heading. If the signal was accurate, he was flying nearly 40 miles south of where he was supposed to be." Margaret frowned. "Why would he do that?" The man hesitated. "Either he got lost, which I doubt, given his experience, or someone told him to change course." That revelation reignited every suspicion. Someone had redirected Danny's flight that day, pulled him off his planned route and into the mountains. But why? Years later, when investigators reopened the case after the wreck was found, they'd uncover a disturbing detail buried in old air traffic logs. The signal from Danny's transponder, the one that marked his last known position, had been manually altered after it disappeared. Someone, somewhere, had changed the data. And it wasn't a mistake. Back in 1972, though, none of that was known. All Margaret had were scraps, rumors, coincidences, shadows. Yet, in her heart, she felt what the evidence couldn't prove. Danny hadn't gone down alone. Sometimes, on clear nights, she'd step outside and look up at the stars. She'd picture him up there, somewhere above the clouds, still flying, still trying to make it home. But as the years dragged on, that image blurred with something darker, the feeling that someone else was still out there too, someone watching, someone waiting to make sure the truth stayed buried beneath the pines. Because in a town like Ellensburg, the wind carried more than just the scent of pine and rain, it carried secrets. And once they started moving, there was no stopping them. And the deeper investigators would dig decades later, the more they'd realize that the mystery of Danny Whitaker wasn't just about a missing pilot. It was about the people who made him disappear. After the last round of newspaper stories faded and the town found new things to gossip about, time did what it always does. It kept moving, even for those who couldn't. Margaret Whitaker aged quietly. She stopped visiting the hangar but never sold the house near the airfield. Every spring, when the snow melted off the ridge, she drove her old Ford up into the mountains with a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars. She'd stand at the overlook until dusk, scanning the horizon for a flash of metal or a hint of smoke. No one ever went with her. She didn't need company. She just needed to keep the ritual. The years blurred. Gas stations changed names, the diner got a fresh coat of paint, and kids who'd once handed out flyers for Danny grew up and moved away. But Margaret stayed. Her hair went gray, her steps slower, her hope thinner, but never gone. The mountain never gave her what she wanted, but it never told her no either. In 1984, a small plane went down near Stampede Pass, and for a few days, people thought it might be Danny. It wasn't. Every time wreckage surfaced in the region, the phone at the sheriff's office would ring, and someone would whisper, "Check if it's Whitaker." The file stayed in a metal drawer marked Cold Cases, Aviation. Dust gathered, but it was never forgotten completely. Meanwhile, strange little things kept happening. One year, Margaret found a fresh footprint in the mud near her porch boot tread, wide, unfamiliar. Another time, she came home to find her front door unlocked, though nothing was missing. She told herself she must have forgotten to turn the key. Still, she started keeping Danny's flight log in a different place each week, just in case. She never knew it, but every few years, someone quietly pulled his case file from that drawer. Once, it was a young state trooper who'd grown up hearing the story. Another time, an investigator from Boise who thought the coordinates didn't make sense. They always hit the same wall, no wreck, no proof, no answers. And eventually, they'd give up, just like everyone else. The mountain had claimed Danny Whitaker. That was the story everyone settled on. By the 90s, Ellensburg had changed. The airport got new management, the wheat fields gave way to suburban lots, and the old pilots who'd known Danny started dying off one by one. The ones who remembered him talked about him like a legend, a man who'd flown too close to something he shouldn't have. When Margaret passed in 1998, her niece found a box under her bed. Inside were letters, dozens of them all addressed to Danny. Some were hopeful, others angry, all signed with love. The last one was dated just months before she died. It read, "If you ever come home, the porch light's still on." After her funeral, the house was sold. The new owners tore down the old map in the living room, the one with the red pins. But behind it, stuck to the drywall, was a yellowing envelope. Inside was a photograph Danny beside his Cessna, smiling. On the back, in fading ink, were 3 words. They were waiting. No one ever figured out who wrote it. And for another 25 years, the mountain stayed silent. Until, one warm afternoon in 2024, a group of hikers wandered off trail and saw something glinting through the pines. That was when the silence finally broke. And what they found would prove that the truth hadn't been lost, it had been hidden. It was early September of 2024 when the forest gave up its secret. 3 friends, Ryan Keller, Leah Torres, and Mason Green, had set out on a weekend hike through the Cascades, following an old fire road that barely existed anymore. They weren't looking for history, just quiet. By late afternoon, the light was starting to fade, soft and golden between the trees. The air smelled of pine sap and wet earth. Ryan was leading the group when he saw a glint of dull metal half hidden beneath moss and ferns. At first, he thought it was an old logging truck. Then he saw the curve of a wing. "Leah," he called, "come look at this." They pushed through the brush. The closer they got, the more impossible it seemed. The fuselage was there, torn but intact, half buried under decades of soil. The forest had grown around it, trees twisting through the broken windows, roots splitting the cockpit. Leah knelt beside a piece of metal, running her fingers over the faded paint. The letters were still visible, though almost erased by time. N146 Bravo. Mason took a step back. "That's a plane," he said quietly. "That's a damn plane." Ryan didn't respond. He was staring into the cockpit, where a shape sat slumped in the pilot's seat, just bone now, wrapped in scraps of leather and fabric. A rusted watch clung to one wrist. Beside it, a flare gun. And something else, a small, cracked notebook. No one spoke for a long time. When they finally radioed for help, the dispatcher thought it was a prank. The coordinates didn't match any known wreckage, but when photos came through, the sheriff's office sent a team immediately. 2 days later, search and recovery crews reached the site. They had to hike 9 miles through rough terrain to get there. The wreck looked like it had been gently placed in the valley rather than fallen into it. The impact marks didn't match a crash. The coroner confirmed the remains belonged to a man in his 30s to 40s, consistent with Danny Whitaker. The watch on his wrist had stopped at 8:31. Inside the cockpit, investigators found the notebook. Most of the pages were ruined by moisture, but one entry was still legible. October 25th. Storm hit sooner than expected. I'm alive, plane's gone, trying to stay warm. And below that, in handwriting that trailed off into a smear, someone's coming, I can hear them. The words sent a chill through everyone who read them. The forensic team cataloged the wreckage carefully. The Cessna had been stripped, no radio, no beacon, no supply kit. The emergency rations compartment was empty. There were drag marks in the dirt beneath the fuselage, suggesting it had been moved long after the crash. The strangest detail was found in the cargo area, a hidden compartment, welded shut from the inside, still sealed tight. When technicians finally pried it open, they found nothing, just an empty space lined with lead sheeting. "What the hell were you flying, Danny?" one investigator muttered. News of the discovery spread fast. Reporters flooded Ellensburg, their headlines screaming about the plane lost for 53 years. Old residents came forward, dusting off memories they'd tried to bury. The younger generation, raised on the legend, treated it like something out of a movie. For Margaret's surviving relatives, it was bittersweet. After decades of waiting, they finally had proof he hadn't run away, hadn't left her willingly. But the notebook changed everything. He hadn't died on impact. He'd survived for at least a day, maybe longer, and someone had been there. The state's cold case unit reopened the investigation within a week. Drone surveys of the surrounding forest revealed something unexpected: faint tire tracks embedded in ancient soil, nearly erased by erosion. Tracks that didn't belong to search teams or hikers. They led away from the crash site, south, toward an area long abandoned since the 70s, once used by private logging contractors. And among those old company records, one name appeared again and again: Robert Gaines, the man who'd hired Danny Whitaker for his final flight. 53 years later, it seemed the story was finally circling back to where it began. The mountain hadn't been hiding a tragedy. It had been hiding a crime. When the wreckage of Danny Whitaker's Cessna was airlifted out of the valley, Ellensburg felt like it had slipped back in time. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office. Retired deputies showed up uninvited, offering memories from half a century ago. For the first time in 53 years, the case file labeled Whitaker, Daniel Missing Pilot was opened again. Detective Claire Donovan from the state's cold case unit led the investigation. She was methodical, sharp, and not easily swayed by legend, but from the start, something about this case unsettled her. The wreck didn't behave like a crash site. There was too much order, no scatter pattern, no debris field. It looked, she said, as if someone set it down there and walked away. Forensics confirmed it. The engine had been removed post-impact, likely with tools. The emergency beacon wiring had been deliberately cut. Someone had visited that wreck, stripped what they needed, and sealed it shut again. Then there was the notebook. The ink analysis placed the final entry at least a day after the crash. Danny had survived through the first freezing night. The smudged line, "Someone's coming, I can hear them," was written in a shaky hand. The coroner's report made things stranger. The fractures were consistent with a rough landing, but not fatal. What killed him wasn't the crash, it was exposure. He'd been alive, trapped, possibly waiting for rescue that never came, or worse, rescue that turned into something else. Detective Donovan's team traced the old coordinates from Danny's original flight plan. The alteration in his last radio call now made sense. The new path led directly toward a region leased in 1971 by Cascade Timber Holdings, a logging company owned by none other than Robert Gaines. Public records showed Gaines's operation had gone bankrupt shortly after Danny vanished, but not before filing one strange insurance claim for lost assets in transit due to weather. The payout, adjusted for inflation, would have been worth several $1,000,000 today. The logging site itself had long been reclaimed by forest, but satellite scans revealed faint clearings and something buried beneath the soil. Large, rectangular impressions, the kind made by heavy containers. When a team excavated one of them, they found remnants of wooden crates lined with lead. No markings, no contents. But the design matched the hidden compartment inside Danny's plane exactly. "Whatever he was flying," Donovan said quietly, "it wasn't rocks." As the pieces fell into place, one name surfaced again: Frank Howard, the so-called insurance investigator who'd shown up in Ellensburg months after the crash. His badge, his employer, even his existence had all been fake. Donovan's team pulled old phone records and found one-link calls made from a number registered to a private security firm in Portland. That firm, too, had been owned by Gaines. It became clear. After Danny went down, someone had gone into the mountains to recover what he'd been carrying. They didn't find it, or maybe they did, and took it. Either way, the plane was moved, stripped, and left behind as if it had never been there. When Gaines's name resurfaced in the press, new tips poured in. One stood out. A man from Oregon claimed that in the mid-70s, he'd worked a construction job under a different name, a man who looked just like Gaines, older, heavier, going by Robert Kane. The job ended abruptly after federal agents started sniffing around a smuggling ring tied to illegal weapons shipments. If it was him, he'd died decades ago, leaving behind nothing but aliases and questions. For Danny's remaining family, it was both closure and torment. They finally knew he hadn't made a mistake. He'd been set up, caught in something far bigger than himself. As the investigation wrapped, Donovan stood over the recovered wreck at the storage hangar. The plane's skin was torn and rusted, but its shape still held. She placed a hand on the metal and whispered what everyone was thinking. "You didn't crash, Danny. Someone put you there." Yet, even with all the evidence, one question refused to die. What exactly had been in those lead-lined crates? No one ever found out. And when the night security guard at the evidence hangar later reported hearing faint tapping from inside the hollow fuselage like knuckles brushing metal, no one believed him. But the sound kept coming, soft and steady, like the echo of a heartbeat buried deep in the mountain's memory. The plane sat under floodlights in a secure hangar, a relic that still seemed alive in its silence. Investigators picked it apart piece by piece, cataloging every bolt, every trace of decay. But it was the cockpit that held the truth. When forensic techs removed the instrument panel, they found something wedged behind the radio stack, a small metal cylinder wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were microfilm strips, perfectly preserved. The discovery stunned everyone. Microfilm in a bush pilot Cessna? It made no sense. Detective Claire Donovan sent it straight to the state lab. Within days, the results came back. Blueprints, maps, and pages of financial data from the early 70s, all linked to Cascade Timber Holdings, Robert Gaines's company. But it wasn't about logging. The files showed transactions routed through shell corporations tied to defense contractors, hidden shipments, false invoices, and payments marked classified. Danny Whitaker hadn't been hauling rocks. He'd been moving evidence. Donovan's theory was simple, chilling, and suddenly very plausible. Gaines had used Danny to smuggle sensitive documents out of state, proof of a weapons smuggling network operating under the cover of timber exports. But when Danny realized what he was carrying, he must have tried to back out. The crates had been bait, the microfilm, the real cargo. Someone had been waiting in those mountains, expecting him to land. The notebook's final line, "Someone's coming. I can hear them." It wasn't just fear. It was recognition. In a locked drawer of the wreck's fuselage, technicians also found something else, a photograph. It showed Danny standing beside the Cessna with two men. One was Gaines. The other was unidentifiable, his face half in shadow. When investigators enhanced the image, they saw a distinctive ring, a crest of an old security agency that folded decades ago. The ring's design matched one worn by Frank Howard, the fake insurance investigator who'd appeared after the crash. That meant only one thing. Gaines hadn't been working alone. Someone higher up, maybe from that same agency, had orchestrated the cleanup. They'd silenced Gaines, retrieved the cargo, and erased the trail. All except the plane they couldn't find. Until now. When Donovan briefed her superiors, they quietly closed ranks. Funding was pulled, reports sealed. She was told to archive the findings, pending federal review. It didn't sit right. That night, she took photos of the microfilm reels with her phone and emailed them to herself. The next morning, the files in evidence storage were gone. No record they'd ever existed. Whatever Danny had died for, it was still powerful enough to vanish in plain sight half a century later. Donovan stood in the hangar alone that evening, the empty plane echoing under the lights. She pictured Danny there in the cold, scribbling his final note, realizing too late that his sky had turned into a trap. For 53 years, his secret had slept under the pines. Now it was awake again, and whoever had buried it once would not want it found a second time. She turned off the light, leaving the wreck in darkness. The wind outside shifted through the hangar doors, whispering across the torn fuselage. It almost sounded like a voice. The wind had picked up again over Ellensburg, cold and sharp, as if the mountains themselves were remembering. The wreck of Danny Whitaker's Cessna sat under a tarp in a government hangar, sealed away once more, but Detective Claire Donovan couldn't let it go. Too many things had vanished around this story. Too many doors closed the moment she knocked. A month after the discovery, she received an unmarked envelope on her desk. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper and a note that read, "He didn't die alone." Attached was a photocopy of an old flight clearance form, stamped with the seal of a federal agency that technically didn't exist anymore. The document listed 2 occupants for the October 23, 1971 flight, not one. Danny hadn't been alone in that plane. The second name had been blacked out, but a faint impression remained. When Donovan scanned it under infrared light, the letters appeared. R. Gaines. Robert Gaines had been on the plane. The realization hit her like cold water. He hadn't sent Danny on that flight, he'd gone with him. Whatever they were carrying, it had gone wrong mid-air. Maybe Danny found out the truth and tried to turn back. Maybe Gaines panicked. Either way, the plane went down. But the wreck told another story. Only one body had ever been found. Donovan followed the old logging road leading south from the crash site, tracing the faint tire tracks spotted in the drone survey. 5 miles in, she reached a clearing where the earth had been disturbed long ago, a rectangular mound now overgrown with moss. She called in a forensics team. Beneath 2 feet of soil, they found human remains. The bones were wrapped in decayed canvas and bound with old rope. In the dirt beside them lay a rusted revolver and a tarnished money clip engraved with the initials R.G. Robert Gaines hadn't vanished. He'd died there, in the same woods that held Danny. The scene was grim but clear. 2 men had survived the crash, one wounded, one desperate. Maybe they argued. Maybe Danny refused to help cover whatever Gaines had done. The revolver's angle suggested close range, a struggle, a gunshot, and silence. Danny's notebook made sense now. Someone's coming. I can hear them. He'd heard Gaines moving through the wreck, calling his name, and after that, the forest took them both. When the remains were confirmed, Donovan expected closure, but instead, she was told to halt the investigation. National security, her superior said flatly. This case is finished. 2 weeks later, the microfilm reels disappeared from evidence storage again, this time for good. No one could say where they went, or who authorized their removal. The report on Gaines's remains was sealed. The official story would stay the same. Pilot lost in storm, plane found half a century later. Nothing more. Still, Donovan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Her emails went missing. A black sedan appeared outside her apartment, then vanished whenever she approached. She knew enough to stop pushing. for now. But the truth had already slipped loose. When she met with Danny's niece to return the last of his belongings, she handed over the flight log, the rusted watch, and the notebook in a sealed bag. She hesitated before leaving and said quietly, "Your uncle didn't run from anyone. He tried to do the right thing. He just didn't know how deep it went." The niece nodded. He wouldn't have left her, not by choice. That night, Donovan drove out to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place Margaret had stood all those years ago. The moon hung low, pale over the trees. Somewhere below, hidden by the dark, was the patch of earth where Danny's story had ended. She poured coffee from her thermos, letting the steam rise into the cold air. Then she left it there on the hood of her car, just like Margaret had always done, a quiet tribute. The wind shifted through the pines, carrying faint sounds, branches creaking, leaves brushing, something that might have been the echo of a distant engine. She smiled, just barely. "Rest easy, Captain," she said softly. The next morning, the hangar lights flickered to life one last time. A cleanup crew had arrived to move the wreck to permanent storage, but as they lifted the tarp, they froze. On the inside of the Cessna's windshield, where no one had seen before, there were faint words scratched into the glass, uneven, shaky letters made with something sharp. Not an accident. Below it, smaller, almost illegible. They were here first. No one could prove when it had been written in the storm, in the days after, or years later by someone who'd found the plane long before the hikers did. The markings were photographed, then quietly sanded away before the wreck was sealed. But the photo survived. It sits in a file marked Evidence, Whitaker, buried somewhere deep in storage. And sometimes, when storms roll over the Cascades and the clouds hang low, hikers say they can hear it, a faint hum through the wind, like an old engine turning over far above the trees. A whisper through the pines that says the same thing every time. He never flew alone.